Hi folks, this video is going to focus on workflow rules within the Zoho environment and accessing custom functions and webhooks. So we're going to go ahead and get started in the admin panel here by clicking on settings, and under automation we're going to go into workflow rules. You'll see a list of all of the workflow rules in this view. You can easily sort and filter the workflow rules by clicking on the All Modules tab up here and then dialing into a specific module that you want to take a look at. This is an easy way that you can quickly see which workflow rules are active and which ones aren't. You can also see what the trigger is, whether they get activated on create or field update, and then how many actions are associated with that particular workflow rule. Another view that you can use is this detailed one. This is great if you want to drill down and actually see what that workflow rule is doing at a high level. So I'm going to go back to that list view and talk a little bit about best practices for workflow rules. As your system evolves, you'll notice that you'll need an increasing number of workflow rules. Zoho has a limit currently that you can only allow 50 workflow rules per module. That may seem fairly limiting until you realize that there are actually 10 conditions within a workflow rule that you have to work with. So in reality, you have about 500 triggered actions and conditions per module. So whenever you're architecting your workflow rules, I highly recommend that you take a look at what the trigger event is and the conditions triggering that workflow rule, and then use conditions as opposed to creating separate workflow rules for each action that you'd like to accomplish. So here you can see there's a perfect example. We have two workflow rules in this instance, where one is pushing a lead, likely activating a webhook on create, and another one here is updating the lead ID. Now, since both of these actions are taking place when a record is created, it would be very easy to combine the two actions into one workflow rule. That will free up the workflow rule and give us more to work with and less to manage as time evolves. Within a particular workflow rule, you have a few different options when you're configuring that workflow rule. And I'm going to go ahead and create a new one to show you what those look like. I recommend you don't get sloppy and leave the description out like I just did, because once again, as your system evolves, you're going to want to know what that workflow rule is doing and what it's triggering. So as we get started here with the workflow rule, you'll be able to choose when it's triggered. You have the options of on a record action, when a specific date or time is met, or based on a score if you use the scoring rules within Zoho. Under a record action, you have a few subcategories. You can trigger this workflow rule whenever a record is created, on create or edit, when anything is edited, and this means any field on that record, or a particular field through a field update, or when it's deleted. Now, a quick note on create. Oftentimes you'll need a workflow rule to get triggered based on an outside action. Make sure that when you are inserting records via an API or making updates through Zapier, that you configure the option to choose workflow equals true. That is the parameter that allows the system to kick off workflow rules based on actions from a third party. Also take note that you cannot have a workflow rule trigger another workflow rule. So oftentimes we will have a workflow rule activate a custom function that may make a change in another module, and based on that change you may want something else to happen. If that is the case, you have to rope those actions into that custom function that kicked off the process. You cannot have a workflow rule trigger another workflow rule and potentially create loops in the system. So once we've chosen our action, we then have to choose the condition for the record that meets that action. So we can either select all records in that module or a specific criteria. Just make sure that you're careful in your naming conventions whenever you are using is. Common mistakes here are leaving trailing spaces or leading spaces. Those can throw things off. And just be cognizant of using spaces in general. If you have specific values that are two words, sometimes those can get tricky to get the rules right, especially when you use the parameter contains. So make sure that you're doing thorough testing of workflow rules in your sandbox environment to ensure that they're triggering the way that you'd like them to. So let's go on to the next step here, which are the actions. So once you have a trigger event that is meeting the criteria for certain records, you then have the ability to schedule instant actions or have scheduled actions that take place later on. The instant actions, you may be limited to how many of these instant actions you can have fire all at once. Generally, you can only choose one webhook or one custom function to happen per workflow rule. So plan accordingly. If you need to stagger them, you can always use the scheduled actions if you need a few different custom functions to trigger. And on the scheduled actions, you can have up to 5 scheduled actions. So 1 immediate, 5 scheduled, 6 total actions that can take place, and each of those actions you can actually have multiple things going on at the same time. On the scheduled actions, please note that currently you cannot go lower than this 15 minutes. So whenever you're designing these workflow rules, things to consider is the order of operations that you write in your custom functions and when Zoho is going to trigger certain actions. Sometimes it's necessary, if you have lots going on, to stagger what you are actually doing. If you need to have a custom function create a password or update a field that is later used in an email notification, you need to make sure that your order of operations are correct so that the function executes first, updates the necessary fields that may be needed, and then sends the email. So generally, to be safest, you may want to have the field updates, webhooks, and custom functions be an instant action, and then any email notifications that rely on the actions of those events to be a scheduled action 15 minutes later. Other things to consider, if you need to have more than the 6 scheduled actions, you can always use multiple workflow rules and then just pick up where this workflow rule left off. If you're triggering actions, say 1 day apart, after the 6th day, you would just open a new workflow rule and then start on day 7. If you have any trouble with these, please don't hesitate to reach out to us and we'll be happy to discuss your use case. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you on the next video.